Good morning. If you were hoping for more of Abraham this morning, I'm sorry, we're done with that study. I'm not doing that anymore. Jeff asked me a moment ago I think the sake of the stream, for a title, what we were doing this morning, and I said the life and times of Elijah and Elisha. So we're going to be in 1 Kings and 2 Kings in the coming days here. I think one of the reasons I wanted to do this study, I wanted to do kind of another character study, looking at people and the things they went through and the things that we can learn from their lives. Specifically, Elijah and Elisha, we remember them for very specific things and not for a lot of the other things that they ended up doing. Elijah, we remember, he's pretty well known. He's mentioned a lot in Scripture, even in the New Testament. We remember him as the guy who says there's going to be no more rain. There's going to be this big fire on Mount Carmel at one point. And then he gets taken up to heaven. And then Elisha goes on, carries on his work. And maybe there's a bear that kills some guys. And that's about all most people remember. And there's really a lot more to it than that. And I think it's important to understand why these men were doing the work they were doing. God does not just send a prophet for no reason. Usually there's a very good reason there's a prophet doing the work that they are doing. So this morning we're not really going to talk about them too much. My plan is to really start with Elijah, go through his life, and then go through the life of Elisha as we see it in 1 Kings and 2 Kings. So basically we're kind of doing some of the latter part of 1 Kings and the first part of 2 Kings is where we'll be. But we're going to make our focus mostly on these two men and anything politically that kind of will affect what they're doing. So I'm not really going to talk about the kings of Judah very much, unless it's part of the story that they're involved in or something that needs to be spoken about. So I'm really going to focus on the northern kingdom of Israel. Before I get to any of that, I want to kind of just do a quick 5-minute summary to get from Genesis to where we're going to be now, since we came from Abraham. The end of Genesis, the grandson of Abraham, that's Jacob, also known as Israel, he and his family settle in Egypt. They're having a great time. Everyone's happy. Everyone's together again. It's all good. And then you turn the page in Exodus, and a lot of time has gone by, and they're all enslaved by the Egyptians. So things took a real hard turn between those two books. Of course, we have Moses and the plagues and all that crossing of the Red Sea. Moses leads the people out of Egypt. They travel 40 years through the wilderness. Then Moses dies. Joshua takes over. They conquer the land of the Canaanites, mostly. There's always that asterisk because they never really wipe out all the people they were told to. They don't take all of the land, but they do take most of it. And then after Joshua's life, you have a series of judges in the book of Judges. God basically has them lead the people through a lot of trials, a lot of really bad things that they were doing and trying to get them back on the right course. And this is just an over and over thing where they do bad. God inflicts some kind of punishment on them, usually an invader from another nation. And then they cry out to God for help. He sends them a judge. The judge delivers them. Everything's good until the judge dies. Then they go back to doing bad things. God sends a foreign army to invade. They cry out to God. He sends another judge. And then that judge delivers them. And basically so on and so forth. That happens about a dozen times in the book of Judges. And you think man, they think they would have learned at the third or fourth time, but they never really do. That's kind of the point here. That never ends. And then we have the last judge, I guess you would call him. He's often usually more called a prophet, the prophet Samuel, who he's basically told by the people, we want a king. We want to be like the nations around us. We want a king. And Samuel, of course, is distraught about this, but God says it's not that they've rejected you, they've rejected me. And God had actually made some provisions for them having a king. We can read about that earlier on before that. But the first king they have is Saul. Saul is of the tribe of Benjamin. And I think we've kind of talked about him in other studies before, so I'm not going to spend too much time on him. But he is the first king of Israel. He leads them in battles with the Philistines, which is kind of the main political and military rival at that time. He's not really considered a great king. He's actually good at first. Things are going okay. He's kind of humble. He's kind of very careful about trying to follow God and his directions, but that quickly goes away. He kind of does his own thing, has his own motives. He becomes very power hungry, very he really wants his line to continue on, and he'll kind of do anything to make it that way. It's not really about God anymore at that point. So God chooses another to succeed him. Of course, that is David. David is actually in the employment of King Saul for some time as both a warrior and a musician, and he wins a lot of battles for King Saul until Saul realizes, oh, this son of Jesse is going to be the one to take my throne. And indeed, that does happen. It takes a long time, but after Saul is killed by the Philistines in a battle, David comes back, and after being on the run as a fugitive of the state, he comes back, becomes king of Israel. There's a bit more detail than that. This is, of course, the 5-minute version. He becomes king, good king, by and large, wins a lot of military victories, kind of eliminates a lot of the Canaanite holdouts. I think we did a study on David some years ago, if you remember. It was not until the reign of King David that Jerusalem was actually taken from the Jebusites. It had been a holdout for a long time. So we associate Israel with Jerusalem so much, but it's not till King David that they actually had that city. It was still in the hands of the Jebusites up to that time. But of course, David had his issues. I'll not go through them all. Some of you are pretty familiar with them. But one of the differences, I think, between David and Saul is when Saul sinned, he may have said, oh, I'm sorry at the time, but then kind of wasn't so sorry. David really wanted to repent. When he did something wrong, he was very appreciative of, I don't know if appreciative is the right word, but he understood God's consequences for his sin, and he really, truly repented of those things. Again, he did have some problems, but he had a heart after God. His son Solomon becomes king. Not his only son. He had a lot of sons, which is part of his problem. But eventually Solomon becomes king as his successor, and he's the one that does, I would say probably the golden age of Israel is under King Solomon. There's peace. He has great wisdom. That's one of the main stories of Solomon. He has great wealth, great riches. There's just chapters and chapters talking about how wealthy he and kind of the nation at large was. And of course, he had great building projects. This, of course, includes the temple of the Lord, which if you read all the details of that, everything's in like gold and silver or some other really nice items. It's just amazing, the descriptions we see. His diplomacy is part of his reign, but it's also kind of part of his downfall. Now, he's able to maintain peace largely throughout his reign through his diplomacy, but this involves a lot of marriages with foreign nations. And you can read about the hundreds of wives and concubines he had, which provided a lot of problems. One notably in this instant is it introduced forms of idolatry. They brought their idols with them. They took Solomon's heart away. This is one of the things he talks about in some of his writings. Again, not getting into too much detail, but there were certainly some issues there with him and his wives. Then after the reign of Solomon, his son Rehoboam comes to power. Now, Rehoboam kind of makes a fatal error here, we would say, a politically fatal error, not at the cost of his life necessarily, but basically he makes the division of the kingdom, which is our chart here that I've put up. You may not be able to read all of these, but this side right here, this is the southern kingdom of Judah, and this is the northern kingdom of Israel on this side. Rehoboam messes up, and another man, Jeroboam, who is from the tribe of Ephraim, comes to power. Ephraim is able to take the 10 northern tribes under his authority. He becomes king, and Rehoboam only has 2 tribes. That's Judah and Benjamin. All the rest are under Rehoboam. So basically from here on out, if I say Israel, I mean the northern 10 tribes. I don't mean the unified kingdom. If I say Judah, I mean the southern 2 tribes. So just for clarification, if I ever say Israel and Judah, that's what I mean. Unless I specify otherwise, just so we know we're all on the same page here. So basically from this point onward, we have these 2 kingdoms. They're never going to reunify. And this is not the entirety here. This actually ends, but this is, well, as far as we're going to go anyway. Jeroboam II is not the last king of the northern 10 tribes, or Uzziah of the southern 2 tribes. It actually keeps going, but this is the chart I found, and I liked it, so it just doesn't go all the way down. I hope there's no confusion about that. I do want to read a little bit about Jeroboam here. We might as well go ahead and turn to 1 Kings chapter 12. I'm going to explain a little bit, and then we'll read a little bit. And we'll move on from chapter 12, but I want to read just a section of it. So Jeroboam he had actually been an official in Solomon's court. He was actually considered to be a really good official, so much so that Solomon put him in charge of a lot of things. But when Solomon kind of learned that Jeroboam was going to take his kingdom away from him, he seeks him out, but Jeroboam flees to Egypt. He comes back after Solomon dies, and this is when he takes over the northern 10 tribes. Now, Jeroboam sees that his people are still going down to Jerusalem because what's in Jerusalem? The temple. So they're going down to the temple to, make their sacrifices to God, all that important worshiping stuff that they would do. But Jerusalem is in the southern kingdom. So they're making these pilgrimages, if you will, to the southern kingdom. And he's worried that, the hearts of the people are going to change. They're going to go back to Rehoboam. I'm going to lose my kingdom. I'm going to get killed. So he makes what I would consider the worst power play in the history of mankind, perhaps, because he's sacrificing literally everything to stay in power. I'm going to read here from 1 Kings chapter 12. I'm going to start in verse 26. It says, Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. That's referring to Rehoboam. Rehoboam would be David's grandson. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their lord Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel and the other in Dan, and this thing became a sin. The people went even as far as Dan to worship the one there. Jeroboam built shrines on the high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made. And at Bethel he also installed priests at the high places he had made. On the 15th day of the 8th month, a month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. So he instituted the festival for the Israelites and went up to the altar to make offerings. All right, so basically what's happening here is Jeroboam is sacrificing all of the possible religious good that is going on in Israel for the sake of staying in power. So he sets up idols, 2 golden calves, one in Dan and one in Bethel. And if you look on a map of the northern kingdom of Israel, Dan would be in the far north and Bethel's in the south. So wherever you are, you can go to one of those points. But it's more convenient than going down or going up to Jerusalem, he says. It's too much for you to do this. And so he sets up these golden calves and says, here are the gods that led you out of Egypt. Ever heard of that before in Exodus, perhaps? When they build the golden calf in the wilderness and the exact same thing is said and really bad things happen from that. You'd think somebody would have been like, hey, I've heard this story before. This doesn't seem right, but somehow he's able to get away with this. It's amazing. But he does more than that. He talks about, all of the holidays, if you will, the festivals that he institutes. He's basically instituting idol worship. Like it is the state-sponsored idol worship, which we can go into a whole bunch of stuff about that specifically, and we will. But this is going to be something that's brought up over and over and over, especially when we talk about the kings of Israel, is they'll talk about a king and they'll say, they did evil in the eyes of the Lord, they followed after the sins of Jeroboam. Even though they may not be descendants of Jeroboam, they're basically doing the exact same things that he did. And so when you see that phrase, the sins of Jeroboam, or following the ways of Jeroboam, it's this. They're going after idolatry, they're pushing God aside, forget morals, let's stay in power. Let's set up these things that will keep us in power. This is kind of what it's talking about. You're going to see that phrase over and over again, and we'll probably skim over that, but I just want to clarify that for when we see that phrase used. Anyway, there's a lot of really messed up stuff that I could go further on. I think one of the most interesting things is you have one of them being set up in Bethel, which if you remember, the name Bethel means house of God. And now he's setting up idols and shrines there to false gods. So it's incredible. Gretchen, you had your hand up. Go ahead. Yes. That would be my understanding, yes. I guess as a blanket term, the northern kingdom of Israel should have been greater and more powerful than the southern kingdom. Part of the reason it's usually not is because there's so much political turmoil, and we're going to kind of go through that. The southern kingdom is a little bit more stable. It maintains a consistent line from David throughout, not so much the northern. In fact, we're going to talk about that in just a second. So, and of course, the northern tribe went after idols long before the southern kingdom got too much into that as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's going to be it's a bigger landmass. Yeah, you can look up. But I mean, and pretty much the other 10 sons' landmass was. Well, they weren't all equal in mass, I don't think. In fact, I would say for sure, because Judah is actually notably a little bit bigger than some of the others. Like Dan and Issachar's, Asher's are not as big. They're not equal. They were in the part that is northern. Yes, those ones would have been, except for Judah. Judah would have been the southern, of course. And Benjamin, and I've talked about this before, and we don't know. We're not always given numbers of what the populations were and all that. We're given at the very beginning of when they're taking the land what the boundaries will be, and we get like a number of certain fighting men from a tribe at one point. But I think by the time we get here, probably a lot of that's changed as far as the population, but we're not told exactly what they are. I will say that Benjamin almost had a total population loss at the end of Judges, when there was sort of this small civil war between Benjamin and the rest of the tribes. There's a whole story about that. But Benjamin was almost wiped out. So when Saul comes to power and he's of the tribe of Benjamin, he says, why would you pick me of the least of the tribes? That's more than just him being humble. It's probably true. It probably is the smallest and most insignificant tribe at that time. But of course, we're a few generations away from that now, by the time we get to the divided kingdom. So what the populations are exactly, we're not sure. But certainly the northern kingdom should have been greater, more powerful. It doesn't always work out that way. We'll kind of read. If you go through the kings, you'll see that. But they also had a lot of moral and political issues too. So, but let's actually get into that here, because I was going to talk about that a little bit anyway. Let's talk about the violent succession in Israel, because it is not peaceful for most of the time. So after Jeroboam died, remember Jeroboam is of the tribe of Ephraim. After he dies, his son Nadab becomes king of Israel. And you can actually see this on the chart. Well, maybe you can. I don't know how good your eyesight is. You have Jeroboam is this dark red at the top, and then there's this little sliver, and then another dark red. That little sliver is his son Nadab. He rules for like 2 years. Not very long, but longer than some. And we're told he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, you're going to see that phrase used pretty much every time for almost every single king of Israel. They did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, Baasha, or however it's pronounced, he was of the tribe of Issachar. He plots against Nadab. Nahab is killed, and Baasha succeeds him as king over Israel. So already you have a break here in the line. You had one of the tribe of Ephraim. Now you have one of the tribe of Issachar coming to the throne. In fact, during his reign, Baasha basically wipes out all of Jeroboam's family lineage and all of his line. Anyone that lived that was of the family Jeroboam is wiped out. We're going to see this multiple times happen. So, and part of that is because Jeroboam and Nadab were so evil, God saw fit to have them wiped out, and Baasha was his tool there. Except Baasha was also evil and did evil in the eyes of the Lord, so not much really improved there. But after he dies, his son Elah becomes king of Israel. So that gets us to, so you have Baasha, that one right there, and then we have this little light sliver right there. That's Elah. He rules for about 2 years. And Zimri, one of his commanding officials, plots against him and kills him. Zimri then becomes king of Israel, and he wipes out the entire family of Baasha. So again, very major turnover here. He wipes out the entire family, the entire royal family. But of course, Zimri also does evil in the eyes of the Lord, and his reign only lasts 7 days. And the reason is basically, as soon as his plot is found out, there's kind of the siege going on of the Philistines by the Israelites. The army that's out there in the field hears about what's happened back in Tirzah, which is where the capital is at the time, and they say, well, we're not going to have any of this. And they make Omri their king, and they go and they lay siege to Tirzah. And basically, Zimri sees that there's no way he's going to get out of here. So he lights the entire palace on fire with him in it. And that's how he dies. So it's not the nicest thing, but that's how he goes. So you have then Omri succeeding him as king. Now, there is a small time where this man named Tibni also is trying to vie for succession, but Omri is able to still push him out. So Omri becomes the king of Israel. In fact, I think this chart shows Omri and Tibni here in this red, and then we have Omri here in this light color there. I don't know why they used red, dark red, and light red. That seems like I don't know, somebody's design choice. So Omri becomes king of Israel. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Omri in a little bit of detail. There are a couple notable things that he does, or maybe not notable, maybe just things that we need to talk about. So one of the things he does is he effectively relocates the capital of the northern 10 tribes from Tirzah to Samaria. There's a few verses that talk about how he built a new city on the hill of Samaria. And that's basically where the capital of the 10 tribes is going to be until it is wiped out by the Assyrian Empire much later on. But usually we associate the northern 10 tribes with the capital, Samaria. It is not that way until Omri comes to power. So it's kind of a Jerusalem situation where we kind of associate a certain city with a kingdom, but it actually didn't have it at first. But eventually that becomes the case. So that's one of the main things he does. If you go ahead and turn over to 2 Kings chapter 16, I'm going to read a little bit from there about Omri. We kind of talked about up till now, all the kings of Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. That's how they're described. We're going to go to 1 Kings chapter 16. I haven't said a verse yet. I'm going to start reading in verse 25 here in a second. But I think one of the interesting things about Omri, it doesn't just say he did evil in the eyes of the Lord like all his predecessors. It's going to say something a little bit different here. Let me read 1 Kings chapter 16. I'm going to start in verse 25. It says, "But Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord and sinned more than all those before him. He walked in the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and his sin, which he had caused Israel to commit, so that he provoked the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger by their worthless idols." So this is really interesting because literally every single king we've seen up till now has been evil. And Omri is also evil, but verse 25 specifically says he did more evil. He did more sin. He followed in the ways of Jeroboam, but it seems to be at a higher magnitude. I'm not sure how that's measured exactly. But Omri is not just a bad king. He is the worst king up to this point. So remember that. He is the worst king. And the bar is pretty high for being worst king at this point. You remember Jeroboam in the first place. He did some really bad stuff. Go ahead, Jeff. Oh, no.
People who are trying to turn the country in what they believe to be the right direction or anything. They're just selfish individuals who want power.
Yeah, there's just, it's a series of power grabs is what it is. And this is not the only time in the Northern Kingdom's history where this happens. When you get to the latter kind of end of Israel, before the Assyrians completely destroy it, you're going to see a ton of basically coup d'etats. Like every couple of years, there's a new king. I think for like 4 or 5 kings or something. I don't remember exactly. I'd have to look back at it. But it's really bad. There's not any respect for, there's this king that God has chosen, and we're going to follow him, and we're going to do these. Because people wanting to follow God is not really a thing. Because Jeroboam has instituted idolatry, and when you have idol worship, your idols become whatever you want them to be. That's kind of the point of idol worship is, I want this to be a thing, so I'm going to have a God that's this thing. You can see that in every form of paganism. Idol worship is, they have these gods of, this or that, and these gods want these things, but that's because that's what the people wanted, or the people that created the idols wanted. That's the real danger of idolatry, is the moral compass does not become a higher moral compass. It's whatever I think I want, and that's what it's going to be. Go ahead, Arnold. Yeah, and we see that in Paul's journeys when he's in Ephesus, especially. That comes out as a very prime motive of the silversmith. I forget his name, but he says, men of Ephesus, this guy Paul, he's messing things up. He's preaching some other god, and he's impacting our ability to make money. He literally says it. Like, he's not hiding it, which is a little bit incredible, because that's the part you don't say, the part that everyone knows, but you don't say it out loud. He says that out loud. Did you hear him?
It's not like it's not blessing Israel. There were times that the northern kingdom was very prosperous.
Yes.
The Bible talks about that. So it wasn't like they left God and God cursed them and they were some wasteland. God blessed them, but they were not able to prosper, even though they were greatly blessed. They had great crops, but things didn't get any better.
Yeah, they kind of had this spiral of, and even some kings who were considered bad or evil would have like a moment or this epiphany, and they would do something right for a change, but then that quickly goes away. There's pretty much no good kings overall in the area of the Northern Kingdom, but there are moments, I suppose, where they do something right or something's going well. We're not going to read a lot about those in this study. I'm sorry, because we're going to talk about Elijah and Elisha. A lot of bad stuff is going on during their time. So let me talk about Ahab real quickly. We're going to read from 1 Kings here. Actually, let me get someone else to read. I'm tired. Someone read for us 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 29 through 33, please. 29 through 33. So not quite the end of the chapter. Okay, that's good right there. Thank you. So this is our introduction to Ahab. Ahab is going to be kind of our main king of the times when Elijah is coming into the scene here. So we're going to see a lot about Ahab as we move forward through this study. But this is how he's introduced here in 1 Kings. So we have him succeeding his father Omri as king of Israel. And it says this happens in the 38th year of the reign of Asa, king of Judah. The kings do this a lot, where someone becomes king. It tells you what reign of the other king, what year it was. It's a historical document. That way we know when certain people come to power. It's not a bad way of doing it, but that's why that detail is there. Not really going to talk about Asa very much. Again, this is more going to be a focus on the northern kingdoms. But at this time, Asa was the king of, this would be pretty much the end of his reign here. Asa ruled for 41 years. He's this big, dark red space right there. Asa was considered largely a good king in the eyes of the Lord. He had his issues as well, but for the most part was a good king. And so toward the end of his reign, this is when Ahab comes to power in Israel. King Ahab continued in the sins of Jeroboam. Verse 30 specifically states that he did more evil than the kings before him. So you remember, all the kings up to Omri were evil in the eyes of the Lord. It says about Omri that he was more evil than all the kings before him. And then we have Ahab, who's more evil than even Omri. So you think things are bad. This is like the worst. This is like the worst king. It does not mince words about Ahab. Ahab has a lot of issues here, some of which are mentioned here, some of which we'll read about as we look through the life of Elijah. One of them is going to be Jezebel. Jezebel is one of the big problems of Ahab's life. I'm sure he still would have been pretty bad without her, but this kind of ratchets it up another notch. I'll talk a little bit about Jezebel. She'll be another one we'll see a lot in this study who will be mentioned. She doesn't really like Elijah. We'll talk about that. Verse 31 talks about King Ahab marrying Jezebel, and she is the daughter of the king of Sidon. Now, Sidon is a Phoenician city-state. It's very powerful. It's north of Israel along the coast. It's kind of in the area where Tyre is. It's a pretty prosperous city-state. It's strong. Doesn't have a ton of land mass, but it doesn't need it. It's an economically strong city, known kind of like Tyre for a lot of their trade, their ability to, shipping and all that stuff. A very powerful city, but the problem here is when he marries her, Jezebel doesn't necessarily bring all that to the table. She brings idol worship, which is already a problem. We've talked about that already, even way back with Jeroboam when he instituted that. Now we have even more idol worship in addition to that. So she brings to the royal court the additional idol worship of the false god Baal. Now, I don't think this is necessarily the first mention of Baal. You're going to see a lot of Baal after this. It kind of becomes a problem even after her time, after Ahab's time. Baal kind of sticks around until they're wiped out. The influence of the false god Baal is very far-reaching. I want to talk a little bit about Baal just for a second so we kind of get an idea of maybe why he was popular where he was in Sidon. Baal was the Phoenician deity of fertility, weather, and storms. So, if you are sailing, weather and storms are kind of a big deal, but also if you're growing crops, the weather is a big deal. So, of course, he's basically, I guess, the Greek equivalent of Zeus, or, the Roman god Jupiter, king of the skies, has power over weather and all that stuff. A really good, powerful god, if you will. He's way up there. So he's a major false god in the Phoenician culture. Jezebel pretty much brings this down, and we have, again, state-instituted false idol worship. We see here that Ahab even builds a temple for Baal in Samaria. We see that in verse 32. Verse 33 also mentions, I think Rose's translation said he set up a wooden pole or something to that effect, wooden image. Other translations will translate that as an Asherah pole. Asherah was another false god. She was a Canaanite goddess of fertility. She is sometimes depicted as like tree-like, if you will. So sometimes, just a wooden image. I think just a pole, that kind of is what a tree looks like, I guess. I'm not going to get too much into that. I don't know enough about it to speak too much to it. But basically, when you see Baal, you're going to see Asherah mentioned a lot too. Ahab is pretty much state instituting these additional false gods on top of the idol worship that was already going on before his time. Later on, as we go through 1 Kings, we're going to see Jezebel constantly pushing for further evil actions on her husband. Again, Ahab is already a bad king, but she kind of pushes him to the limit of being as evil as possible, if you will. We're going to see that as we go through. You probably know, like, if you were to call a woman a Jezebel, that's like not a nice thing to say. That means like there's something really wrong with this woman. So if you're nice, you don't call ladies Jezebels. And so that I'm assuming her inclusion here is something to do with that. But basically, this is going to be the state of Israel when Elijah enters the scene here. So just so you know, this is what Elijah's getting into when we get into the next chapter. So we have Elijah here. The maker of this chart included Elijah and Elisha in here. So we have King Ahab's rule. That's when Elijah starts to show up. And he's going to basically be contending with King Ahab for the duration of his life. It's going to be a real kind of contention between the two. Any thoughts, comments on any of that before we maybe start chapter 17 here? So during Rehoboam's reign, when he succeeded Solomon as king, he was basically, the people asked for him to, make things easier, because under the reign of Solomon, they had been doing some great things, but it was also really taxing the people, if you will, in a literal sense, both monetarily and in their labor. And they asked for a reprieve from that, and he sought advice from an older council that said, yes, go ahead and do what the people ask. And then he asked for advice from people his age, younger people would say, no, say that you're going to make their burdens heavier and they're going to have to work harder. And he follows that advice. So he basically tells the people, he goes back and says to the people, my father did this, I'm going to make it even worse. And I'm going to, be even more dominant over you, and you're going to work even harder. And they didn't like that. So they decided to follow Jeroboam instead. That's the 10-second summary of that. Yeah, so about 997 BC is when that split occurs. Again, Jeroboam was not an unknown. He was an official in Solomon's court. He had just been hiding out in Egypt until after Solomon died, and they basically invited him back in and said, hey, so-and-so's not around anymore. Would you like to take this throne? Which is an interesting thing. We see that in history all the time, where you have like a prominent political person, they go into exile or they go into hiding for a while, but then when whoever's in charge dies, that person's still really popular, so they go seek them out and they bring them back in. I could go through a number of historical examples. I won't, but that is a thing that happens quite a bit. And that's what begins the split, basically, from here on then. There's not really much of an effort for them to reunify. In fact, a lot of times they're fighting each other. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're working together. It just depends on what the political climate is, really. Sometimes Judah will ally with Aram, which is north of Israel, so that they can kind of tag team and beat up Israel, and it just depends. There's really no allegiance or goodwill toward each other necessarily. It's kind of sad, really, if you will. There's never any reunification in that regard. The northern tribes will be taken up by the Assyrian Empire later on. After that, the Babylonian Empire will come in and take out Judah. So there will never be, Solomon's reign is really the highest that ever gets, and then it's on the decline really after that. Not to say they didn't ever have good times or prosperous times, but they were never as good as Solomon's day, as far as I can tell, at least from the descriptions we have. Yeah.
You mentioned that this whole thing was of God.
Yes.
God sent a prophet to Jeroboam even before Solomon's reign was over.
Yes. Yes.
That he would be giving him a kingdom, and if Jeroboam stayed faithful to God, he would make sure that his children continued to rule after him. And then when Rehoboam did his thing, as you described, and the division took place, Rehoboam saddled up 180,000 soldiers, and he was going to go fight them and force them to stay unified. And
he certainly regretted it. That's for sure. Yeah.
regretted what he had done, but this was God's punishment. And though David's line continued, because David was faithful,
Mm.
it was not a prosperous line, not near as prosperous as it could have been, should have been, and even Jeroboam could have been strong. But it's interesting as you go through reading these events at this time, they still call one another brethren. They, many, they do fight one another from time to time, but they do recognize that they're descendants of Abraham. It's interesting. I was looking for the scripture a moment ago, couldn't find it, but there's at least one passage that alludes to the fact that not long after the division took place, a lot of the people who did not want to listen to Jeroboam and wanted to be faithful to Jehovah migrated from the northern area back down into Judah. And so there was obviously the people who didn't support idolatry, who did want to go to Jerusalem and take the trouble.
Mm.
Jeroboam said it's too much. No, it's not too much. God commands. They migrated down into Judah, and so the nations kind of formed along either the lines of, well, it's not really as simplistic as God is.
It's never that simple. Yeah.
It's not as simple as that.
And as you're talking, my explanation earlier really makes it seem much less simple than I said, which it is. You're correct. So I appreciate you giving a little more detail on that. So basically, the split was foretold by God long before the split happened, but Rehoboam certainly didn't help himself in that regard. And Jeroboam, who, like you said, he had basically the same promise God gave to Saul and to David, but like Saul, he did not continue to listen to God, and so his line was ended literally. Baasha wiped them all out. There were no more, which is.
And one other thing, Jeroboam set up the idols because he was afraid the Israelites would go back down to Jerusalem and want to rejoin the southern kingdom. If he trusted in God, God would maintain his
Yeah.
kingdom. God would have done that, but he would not trust God to do that. He wanted to do it his way, and it led to,
All this.
it's a hot mess.
Yeah, it sure is. And, and I say like it affects the northern 10 tribes, and certainly it does, but Jeroboam's introduction of, state-sponsored idolatry, if you will, that's a simple way of saying it, I guess, does affect Judah also. A lot of the prophets will talk about how Judah followed in the ways of Israel, because it's not like, they're not talking to each other. There's no interaction. They see what they're doing over there. A few of them get the idea that, hey, this seems like a nice thing. I like what they're doing. They take it back with them to Judah, and it's there. It's festering. Again, the northern tribes seem to have had it worse, and they fell much quicker, but Judah was not immune to that either. And so Jeroboam really messed up everybody in that way. Even though God had given him those promises, like Jeff said, he was not faithful to God and did not trust God to follow through with that. I guess we're at a time. I wanted to get a little farther. I wanted to start in chapter 17, but we're going to have to save that for another time. If you want to start maybe getting ahead for the study, go ahead and read chapter 17 for this week, and then we'll talk about it next Sunday. We'll talk a little bit about Elijah. We're not given a lot of detail about him personally, like where he came from, any of his backstory. He's just kind of there suddenly at the very beginning of chapter 17. Now here's Elijah, and here's what he says and does. And not a lot of stuff leading up to that, but we'll talk a little bit about what we do know and basically what he's going to be doing. And Elijah has an exciting tenure as a prophet, if you will, probably more so than he would have liked. Elijah is one of those interesting characters who really tells God what he thinks, and sometimes he doesn't have the best thoughts. So we'll go through that. So we'll begin chapter 17 next week. Thank you.